Hi, friends. So, I spend a lot of time on the internet. I know, shocker. And one of the questions that I get asked or see asked over and over and over is I want to turn a bowl, a platter, uh, spindles for chairs, goblets, what have you. Where do I start? And it's a great question because where you start and how you start in turning can vary. Now, I want to be clear, just so we set expectations here. I'm not an expert. I've not turned thousands of bowls. I don't sell in galleries. I don't even bother selling my work because, frankly, it's a pain in the butt. But I have spent dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of hours researching how you start turning. And really, what it boils down to is turning as a hobby, as an accessory to other woodworking activities, or as your principal woodworking hobby, is a really easy hobby to get into. But you'll enjoy turning a lot more if you put a little forethought into it, if you make the right choices and get yourself set up correctly from the get-go. Now, there's a couple things to keep in mind. When you're turning, when you're setting out to turn, you really need 4 pieces of equipment to get started. And in order of importance, first and foremost, you need a lathe. You really can't turn without one. Second, you're going to need a chuck. That is this piece here that goes on the headstock. And chucks come in a variety of sizes and made by a variety of manufacturers. Now, I originally started with a Nova. That's this chuck here. And this is your standard 4-jaw chuck. Fairly straightforward. And this is a Nova, I believe G3 is the technical term. And I really like this chuck. But I moved away from it, not because I had any real issue with it, but simply because this chuck is intended for mini and Midi lathes. The chuck that I have on my lathe right now is a one-way stronghold chuck, and that's intended for full-size lathes. So I was able to turn bigger projects safely with the one-way versus the Nova. The Nova is a bit cheaper, so if you're getting into turning and you have a smaller lathe and you don't want that large initial outlay of cash, perfectly fine chuck. Now, when you buy a chuck, they come with jaws. So these 4 pieces in the front here. And there are different jaws for different applications. Generally, these 2-inch round jaws will be sufficient for most any bowl turning you do on a small to medium-sized lathe, a mini or a Midi lathe. There are larger jaws, there are spigot jaws, there are flat coal jaws for holding the front face of a bowl. There's jaws for pretty much every application, and I could spend easily a 15 or 20 minute video just going over the jaws that I own, let alone all the jaws that are available. So we're not going to do that. So to recap, most important piece of equipment, your lathe. Second most important piece of equipment is your chuck. Third most important piece of equipment are your tools. Now, tools come in a variety of shapes and sizes. This is your standard 1/2-inch bowl gouge, specifically a Sorby 1/2-inch bowl gouge. And when you buy tools that turn on a lathe, you can buy really cheap tools from something like a Harbor Freight. You can buy more intermediate tools, like the Sorby tools here. You can buy really expensive tools, like the Carter & Sons Tool Works gouges and skews that you've seen me use in some of my turning videos. What you buy isn't necessarily going to affect the performance of the tool. For example, a 1/2 inch gouge, regardless of who makes it, is a 1/2 inch gouge. The difference from manufacturer to manufacturer is going to be in the setup, so that is how well built the tool is, the type of steel the tool's made of. Higher quality tools, better quality steel. Better quality steel holds its edge better. You're not going to have to sharpen as much. And last but not least, the level of support you get. And this is often overlooked. I broke a Sorby gouge. Small version of this one right here. And I broke it doing nothing wrong. I was doing some spindle work and my spindle roughing gouge broke. It took me 3 months to get a hold of Sorby tools and to have them ship me a replacement. Now, that's not 3 months including shipping delays. That's not 3 months including waiting in customs. That's 3 months just to get a response from the company. Now, if I had an issue with my Carter & Sons gouges, Carter & Sons Tool Works is located in Seattle. They're a 35-minute drive from my front door. I could drive down there and say, hey guys, the heck? Now, if I go to something like a Harbor Freight and I buy really inexpensive Harbor Freight tools, they're not going to support anything. Now, lastly, what you need, the last tool, the fourth tool you need after your lathe, your chuck, your turning tools, is your grinder. And you need a slow speed grinder. And I have a Rikon slow speed grinder over there. And in terms of your grinder, you can go cheap. I went middle of the road. Some of the other guys in the Seattle woodturners have super high-end fancy grinders. There's entire dedicated systems for sharpening turning tools. Frankly, buy a cheap grinder, because all it's going to mean if it's cheap is it's going to take longer to get up to speed. And let's be honest, the difference between it speeds up in 2 seconds and speeds up in 7 seconds, does it really matter? Not to me. Now, the other tool that I'm not including in this list is the one you can see behind me. That's a bandsaw. Now, a lot of people, when they talk about getting into wood turning, they say the 2 tools that you absolutely must have are a lathe and a bandsaw. Nah, I disagree. A bandsaw is really helpful, hugely helpful, because you can take raw wood, literally chunks of tree, and turn them into bowl blanks, and then turn those bowl blanks into bowls. But in order to do that, there's a ton of steps that have to happen. You have to understand, 1, what wood's worth saving and what wood isn't. 2, how do I process a round into a bowl blank? How do I store green wood so that it doesn't check or crack? How do I dry a once turned bowl so I can then turn it again into a finished product? And again, I could go for a 20-minute video just on how to turn a round into a bowl blank. And I probably will do that in the coming weeks. So you can also order all of your bowl blanks from commercial suppliers like Rockler, Woodcraft, or others. And that means for a relatively small fee, $10 a bowl, you can order round, sealed, dry, ready to turn bowl blanks. And for an introductory turner, somebody getting into the hobby, that's a way better investment. You're going to spend a heck of a lot less time worrying about prepping your wood and a lot more time turning. And when you're first getting started, when you're starting to learn your tools, your techniques, how to cut, how to move with your lathe, time at the lathe is invaluable. Time at the bandsaw doesn't really help. And let's be honest, just about anything I can do with that bandsaw sitting behind me, I can do with a chainsaw. And I'm going to spend a lot less money on a good chainsaw than I am on a good bandsaw. So if you do want to get into turning and you do want to process your own wood, I wouldn't say buy a bandsaw. I would say buy a good chainsaw. So let's recoup. Lathe, Gotta have one of those. Chuck. Make sure your chuck fits your lathe and fits what you want to turn. Most chuck manufacturers will give you a data sheet with the chuck that tells you how big a piece you can turn, how fast you can turn that piece, and some rough ideas around what they consider safe. You need tools, and you need a grinder. Now, I'm going to go into detail on the lathe a little bit because, as you may have noticed, I kind of skipped over that one, and I wanted to save the best for last. Lathes come in 3 sizes. There's a mini, a Midi, and a full-size lathe. Now, this one behind me is a Laguna 1836. That means it'll take an 18-inch diameter bowl and a 36-inch long spindle. That's the max I can turn on this lathe. And I bought the 1836 because there's almost no chance I'm going to outgrow this lathe. There's almost nothing that I would want to turn that I couldn't turn on this lathe. But does that mean if you want to get into turning, you have to buy a monster lathe like this? No, of course not. If you're going to get into turning, look on Facebook Marketplace or look on your used buy-sell trade sites and look for a jet mini lathe, and specifically a jet, because frankly, they're the creme de la creme. And if you're going to buy a lathe, you might as well buy a good one. And jet lathes, they hold their value beautifully. So you're going to buy it, you're going to spend a couple $100, and if you don't like it, you can sell it on for almost the exact same price you paid for it. And oftentimes, if you buy used, it'll come with a chuck, and that saves you a little bit of money. Now, the mini lathes are fantastic. Even if I have a full-size lathe, like this one here, I'm debating buying a mini lathe. Why? I have a huge lathe. Why would I need a small one? Because if I want to do small turnings, pens, ornaments, small hollow forms, I can turn them on this lathe, but it's not as simple as that. There is this is difficult to explain. You turn on a big lathe with big tools, it's hard to do small work. The tool rest is big. The headstock is big. Everything is big. Where if I have a mini lathe and I'm turning small things on a small lathe with small tools and a small chuck, I'm going to get better results. And I want to touch on pen turning for a moment because a lot of senior wood turners scoff at pen turning. Pen turning is a wonderful entry point to the hobby, and it's a wonderful way for you as an early wood turner to produce usable, showable, sellable items that you can take pride in very, very quickly. And there's tons of great pen turning demos that you can find on YouTube. Now, the one step up from a mini lathe is a Midi lathe, M-I-D-I. And Midi lathes are a relatively new invention. They've come about, or I should say be popularized, in recent years. And a Midi lathe, in many ways, is kind of a hybrid. They tend to be more powerful. They tend to have a longer bed. They tend to have a slightly larger headstock. That's this drive part up here. And they tend to be designed really for supplementary turning. That is, I'm a chair maker or a table maker, and I want to turn my own spindles. Or I want to turn bowls for lampshades, or I want to turn platters. They tend not to be the large full-scale turnings that you would see a full-size lathe for, but they also tend to be slightly larger than what you're going to turn on a mini lathe. Now, last, of course, you have your full-size lathes. And I mean, even the 1836, which is a huge piece of equipment, is not particularly big when it comes to full-size lathes. Laguna makes bigger lathes than what I have behind me. Powermatic makes monstrous lathes. And there are companies that make lathes for turning 30 and 40 inch bowls. I mean, just massive, massive lathes. And those are really intended for high-end hobbyists or commercial shops, or someone like myself that wanted to buy a lathe and never have to worry about it again. And here we are. So let's recap. Why would you buy a mini, a Midi, or a full-size lathe? Fantastic question. You buy a mini lathe either because you're just getting into the hobby and you want something you can experiment with, which is totally valid, or you have a larger lathe and maybe you want something portable, valid, or you're a maker. You have a more general purpose shop and you're looking for something that you can use as a maker to supplement other activities. In all these cases, a mini lathe, specifically a jet mini lathe, fantastic choice. There are other manufacturers, but again, buy jet, it's just easier. Why would you buy a full-size lathe? You'd buy a full-size lathe because you want a commercial quality lathe. You want something you're unlikely to outgrow. And I'll break down the actual features of the lathe behind me in another video. Now, astute viewers may notice I skipped over why would you buy a Midi lathe. And that's because when I was putting together kind of the rough outline for this episode, I couldn't come up with a reason why you would buy a Midi lathe. I couldn't. Now, Midi lathes either come without legs, so you need a bench for them, or you buy the legs separately. Which if you buy the legs separately, they're almost the same price as a full-size lathe, which is more powerful, more features, more stable, easier to put together. Midi lathes aren't as portable as mini lathes. They take up more bench space and they're more expensive. I literally don't know why you would buy one, but if you have one and you love it and you can't imagine how you ever lived without it, tell me down in the comments because frankly, I want to know because I don't understand. So, you want to be a wood turner, you want to start turning. Lathe, mini or full size. Chuck, something that fits your lathe. Jaws, whatever floats your boat. Start with the ones that come with the chuck, branch out from there. Tools, buy good ones, it's worth it. Grinder, buy cheap ones, it ain't worth spending the money. Bandsaw, just get a chainsaw. Go out in the shop, make some sawdust. Thank you for hanging out with me. We'll see you next time.